This presentation will be addressing environmental toxicology. Now, of course, the first thing we need to do is define what do we mean by environmental toxicology. Well, let's start with a definition of toxicology as a broader field of study. And in one definition from the Society of Toxicology, seems a good one to start with, is that toxicology is a discipline that integrates all scientific information to help preserve and protect health and the environment from the hazards presented by chemical and physical agents. So that's a broader field, and now let's focus in on what is environmental toxicology. Well, the UC Davis department defines it as the study of how chemicals move within the environment and affect biological systems. So this includes toxic agents that affect both humans as well as non-human animals. Now, of course, in environmental health science, we're concerned with the impacts on human health, and that will be the focus of this presentation. However, we can't discount the fact that most toxic agents, toxic chemicals, physical agents always affect more than just humans, more than just one species. And in fact, when toxic agents affect other species, very often the change in those species affects the environment, the ecosystems in which we find ourselves, and they come back to affect human beings and human health. So we really can't separate it completely, and just as we can't separate the human environment from the natural environment, they're all interconnected. Again, though, we'll focus on the effects of environmental toxic agents on humans. All right, well, let's begin with some terminology. We have to have the same language that we're all using. The first is the term xenobiotics, and this refers to any chemicals that are foreign to the human body. And they can either be naturally occurring or created by humans, created man-made chemicals. So xenobiotics aren't necessarily bad. The medicines that we take are xenobiotics that cure a lot of our illnesses or relieve symptoms of illnesses. But in general, when we talk about xenobiotics and environmental toxicology, we're talking about things that are toxic agents. So any material or factor that can be harmful to biological systems are toxic agents, whether they're chemicals or heat or radiation. Those are all toxic agents. Now, when we focus in on chemicals, we refer to toxic substances, or sometimes referred to as poisons. Those are chemicals that have toxic properties that are harmful to biological systems. Toxicity is simply the degree to which something is deleterious to the biological system. How toxic is it? Is it highly toxic? Is it moderately toxic? Every toxic substance has a different level of toxicity to human beings, and very often a different toxicity of the same chemical to other species. The term toxicant simply refers to those toxic substances that are artificially created. And lastly, the word toxin, and I might slip and use the word toxin in a more general way, but a specific definition of toxin, it's usually referring to a toxic substance, toxic chemical, that's made by a living organism. So think of the bite of a black widow spider, or a plant that's poisonous to eat, like the hemlock plant, or poisonous mushrooms. So those are organisms that produce toxic chemicals, and if we ingest them or get them into our bodies in some other way, they can be toxic to us. All right, so what's the problem? Well, there are more than 80,000 synthetic chemicals that are in use in the United States. More worldwide, but in the United States, and there's more in the United States than any other country, there are an estimated 80,000 chemicals new to nature, created by people that don't have a natural existence in the biological world. And these are used for a wide range of things. everything from food additives to chemicals that go into the air that are byproducts of burning fossil fuels, to chemicals that are used in making materials like plastics, chemicals that are used as solvents, as cleaning agents. There's just a myriad of uses of chemicals that have been created by people to solve certain problems that we want to address in our daily lives or as a society. And each year, the chemical industry, across a wide range of industries, is creating more and more new chemicals, adding to that 80,000. It's estimated about 2,000 new chemicals are created for various uses in various industries every year. Many of these chemicals are known to be toxic. Most have not been studied for their toxicity specifically. And in fact, for most of them, we don't know whether they are toxic or not. And of course, many of these chemicals make their way into the environment, the human environment and the natural environment, through various means. They may be intentionally released, they may be unintentionally released. They may be a byproduct of doing things like burning the gasoline in your car and putting byproducts of gasoline combustion into the air. The release of chemicals may be perfectly legal. There are standards set that allow chemicals to be released into the environment at certain concentrations. And of course, a lot of chemicals may be released illegally, simply illegally dumped, or ignoring the regulations. And of course, when we look worldwide, we find that every country has different laws and different levels of enforcement of the release of chemicals into the environment. All right, let's walk our way through some of these important concepts in environmental toxicology. The first thing I want to talk about is exposure, okay? How are people exposed to these toxic agents? We can inhale them. Gases, vapors, dust can be inhaled into the lungs. So that's a route of exposure, is our lungs. Ingestion, we can eat it, right? It can be in our food. Those chemicals could be in what we drink, or they can be in other substances that get into our gastrointestinal tract. And then there's direct contact. The skin, the eyes, the skin can be unbroken skin or it can be broken skin that allows a toxic agent to get into our blood system. Now, this concept of dose, we'll talk about dose a lot in this lecture, is simply the amount of toxic agent in the exposure. And dose is related to the concentration of the toxic agent and how much of it then makes it into the human body, either through the lungs, through the GI tract, or through the skin or eyes. Now, there's some considerations here in terms of environmental toxicology. One is, what is the source of the toxic agent? The exhaust pipe of a car, pesticides being applied through a sprayer, a stormwater runoff that's carrying all kinds of oil and grease and other toxic agents off of our streets and into our water systems. Food additives, things that are added intentionally to food that may or may not be good for us to be consuming, particularly when we consume them in large quantities. How do these toxic chemicals move around in the environment? What's the pathway? Are they vapors in the air, dust in the air? Is it being carried through water systems, in the water, the groundwater, surface water? Is it found in the soil? Is it concentrating in the soil? Is it in our food? Or is it radiation? So not all toxic agents are chemicals. Some are physical and some are radiation, like sunlight. The sun itself, the ultraviolet rays of the sun can result in sunburn. And then what's the entry point of the body? And I've already mentioned the lungs, the skin, the eyes, and the gastrointestinal tract. So all of these are considered when looking at different toxic agents in the environment and the level of exposure that people are going to incur. Now, the duration of exposure is important. We can put them in categories of acute and chronic. Acute exposure is a short-term exposure, typically to a large dose of a toxic agent. So it has an effect on people because you get a large dose in a short period of time. That's an acute exposure. A chronic exposure is where you're exposed over a long period of time, typically to small doses over a long period of time. A chronic exposure might be low levels of pesticides that are coming off of farm fields and polluting adjacent homeowners, but only small amounts, but you're getting those doses day after day, year after year. Particularly if you are working in the farm industry, if you're a farm laborer, you're getting doses. An acute dose might be, stick with pesticides, an accident where a large amount of pesticide is spilled and it's inhaled by the people that are near that spill. That would be an acute exposure. Now, synergistic effects are where you're exposed to multiple toxic chemicals, and the combination of those chemicals may have a greater effect, a greater toxic effect on humans than each of the chemicals alone would have, and that's referred to as a synergistic effect. This little table at the bottom gives a set of standard terms for duration of exposure, acute, subacute, kind of giving you a sense of the length of time. So, acute would be a single exposure in less than 24 hours. Chronic would be repeated exposure for more than 3 months, and then sort of steps in between. I don't expect you to remember these, but understand the difference between an acute exposure and a chronic exposure, and you should be able to recognize an example of each. Okay, well, what happens when toxic chemicals get into the human body? As I've said, they enter through lungs, skin, eyes, or the GI tract. And then what happens is absorption into the bloodstream. Okay, your lungs are intimately connected to the bloodstream. Your gastrointestinal tract is intimately connected to the bloodstream. Anything that can pass through your skin can get into the bloodstream, or into your eyes, can make it into your bloodstream, and the bloodstream then passes it through your body and very rapidly moves it. So once a chemical agent gets into your bloodstream, it can then be transferred very rapidly to all of the tissues and organs around your body. And it may have an effect on many organs and tissues, or a toxic substance may have an effect only on a specific organ. We call that a target organ. Now, what goes on in your cells is what's called biological transformation. This can happen in your cells where the toxic substance is converted into a new compound. Okay? It doesn't always happen. Sometimes toxic substances are very stable in your body, can be very dangerous if your cells can't metabolize them in any way. But biological transformation is when your cells metabolize the toxic substance into something new. It may aid in the breakdown and removal of the toxic substance, what we would call detoxification. That's a good thing. Or it might result, biological transformation might result in products of that toxic substance that are actually more toxic than the original substance. So we can get a good result or a bad result from biological transformation. So we can then look at the intensity of the effect of the toxic substance. Okay, so once a chemical is absorbed into your body, how it affects your body is dependent on a number of things. One is the concentration. What concentration of that toxic chemical reached a target organ or organs? And in what chemical and physical form did it reach those target organs? What happens after it's absorbed? Is it transformed, or does it maintain its original chemical condition as it moves through your body? And also, how long does it remain? Some substances can sequester in your body and remain there for long periods of time. Others, your body is able to pass them rather quickly out of your body, and that can be beneficial to detoxifying, is to be able to flush a toxic chemical out of your body quickly. Now, when we look at the intensity of effect of a toxic substance, we refer to the dose response. And this essentially is the greater the dose, the more the effect. And this quote, "The dose makes the poison." Poison is a generic term for toxic substances, right? Toxic chemicals. Below a certain concentration, at low doses, the substance may not be harmful. In most cases, it means your body is able to deal with it, to biotransform it, to flush it from your system such that it doesn't have a harmful effect. So those low dose concentrations may not be harmful, but above a certain dose, the substance begins to have an effect and begins to be harmful on tissues and organs within, or cells, tissues, and organs within the body. And of course, different chemicals are going to have different, what we call dose responses in biological systems, and we're interested in the human body and how chemicals affect the human body. The dose of the toxic chemical is really important in the response of the body to that chemical. What does a toxic chemical do? Well, it may cause injury at the site of first contact, irritating the throat, irritating the eyes. Upon absorption and distribution by the blood, it may affect other parts of the body. Some effects may be reversible and some may be irreversible. So a reversible effect is typically a short-term exposure at low concentration doses would be reversible. Your body can repair itself. It can flush the toxin. An irreversible effect is more common with long-term exposures at high concentrations. But of course, highly toxic substances can provide irreversible effects with only a short exposure. Think of the most potent poisons can damage your body even at a very low concentration, short-term exposure. We'll talk about that in a minute. Some effects may be immediate and some may be delayed, and we'll talk about latency. Okay, so what does the body do? How does it deal with toxic chemicals? I mentioned biotransformation already, by cellular metabolism. So changes in the toxic substance that form a less toxic or non-toxic substance. So that's your body detoxifying the poison. The toxic substance may be transformed into a form that is more easily excreted from your body. And this is typically by changing the toxic chemical from being fat soluble to being water soluble. Because something that's water soluble can dissolve in water, can go into your urine and be flushed by your urine out of the body. So that's a common transformation that happens in the body with changing a toxic substance to a form that's water soluble and easily flushed from the body. Now, your liver is your primary detoxifying organ. It takes toxic chemicals and by biotransformation detoxifies them, makes them water soluble, puts them into the bloodstream, and allows them then to reach the kidneys where they are filtered out of the blood and flushed out of the body through the urine. You may not think of your nose as an important defense, but it is. The nose hairs block large particles from entering your lungs, from getting even past your nose. And the mucus in your nose forms around pollutants that get into, particles that get into the nose. And when you sneeze, you're driving them out before they can enter your airways and get to your lungs. The lungs and the bronchial tubes have their own mechanism. There's mucus formed in the lungs and in the bronchial tubes that pick up fine particulates that get into the lungs. And then through coughing, you cough out that mucus with the toxic substances in it, and you get that out of your bronchial and lung systems. There are cilia on the surface of your lungs and bronchial tubes. And those cilia, they're like little hairs and they move in waves, and they can push particulate matter that's stuck onto the walls of the bronchial tubes and the lungs. They can move that upward and slowly move it upward as it's gummed up with mucus until it gets high enough into your bronchial tubes that you can cough it out again. These are ways that your respiratory system can expel toxic substances. And of course, if you ingest something that's toxic and it upsets your stomach's response is to throw it up. And so vomiting can reduce toxic chemicals before they're absorbed, can get them, remove them from the body before there's a chance of those toxic substances getting into your intestines and being absorbed into the bloodstream. So if you are nauseated by a substance and you throw it up, you have gotten it out of your system before it's had a chance to absorb those toxic substances into your bloodstream. So a very general, obviously, overview of how your body deals with and expels toxic chemicals. So I mentioned already toxicity as the strength of the toxic substance. And there's a lot of variability among chemicals in terms of their toxicity to humans and to other animals. It's dose dependent, so the greater the dose, the greater the toxicity. It's quite variable. Many toxic substances have different effects or different dose requirements to cause an effect on different individuals within a population. So the toxicity of a given substance at a given concentration may be different depending on the people that it's affecting. Some of the individual characteristics that affect chemical toxicity are age. In many cases, young people and older people are more susceptible to a toxic substance at a lower concentration, a lower dose, than are healthy people in the prime of their lives. Male versus female, there's often differences in toxicity depending on sex. One of the clearest determinants of toxicity is body mass. And typically we look at dose relative to body mass or weight. So the smaller the person, the smaller the dose needed to have a toxic effect. The larger the person, the larger the dose of the toxic substance to have a toxic effect. The general health of the person, of course, we know that people who have already some health challenges may be more susceptible to a new challenge to their body. A toxic substance being introduced is going to be more dangerous to somebody who already has health issues than someone who is generally in a healthy condition. And then lastly, and very importantly, is genetics. The variation across the human population, of course, the variation across all living species. There is genetic variation, and some individuals are more affected and some less affected by certain toxic substances at the same concentration because they are genetically able in some way to deal with that particular toxic substance. So there's variability in the human population in terms of susceptibility to different toxic chemicals. So what's called this dose response curve is an important tool that's used in toxicology and, of course, in environmental toxicology also. And it's the relationship between the dose of the toxic agent that enters the body and the amount of harm or the response that that dose causes. If we look at the graph, and this example is a curve for alcohol consumption. So you can see on the x-axis, as the dose increases, the response increases. And we have different levels of response described here in words. Of course, responses can also be measured often in certain numerically or quantitatively, but this is a qualitative response curve here. And so we see that at low doses, one drink maybe, there's no effect. After a few doses of alcohol, people start to get giddy. Eventually they start feeling tired, they get sleepy. They may drink so much that they fall into a deep sleep and unconsciousness, and eventually it builds up, getting past the liver. The liver only can detoxify alcohol at a certain rate. You consume it too fast, your liver can't keep up, and eventually you may get to the point of death. The threshold, the red line, where that meets the dose line, is the threshold dose. The threshold is the dose at which you begin to see the first symptoms, the first response. And that would be giddiness in this example. Okay? So that's the threshold. That's when you see a concentration of the dose having its first effects, its first response. And it's the lowest dose where there's a response. Here's another way to look at toxicity. It's what's called the LD50, which is the median lethal dose. Okay, 50% of individuals in a population die at a certain dose concentration. Now, of course, these are tests that are done on test animals. They may be fish, they may be mice, but doses are applied at increasing amounts until half of the animals in the test group are no longer alive. And you'll notice that these dose response curves are usually set up where the response is percent death, percent mortality for an LD50 curve, and the dose is given on a logarithmic scale in terms of milligrams per kilogram body weight. Okay, here comes that body weight being normalized here by calculating the dose as the milligrams of the toxic substance per kilogram body mass of the animals it's being given to. Okay, so here's some examples of toxicity levels as measured by LD50 for different toxic substances. First one being alcohol, right? Ethyl alcohol in milligrams per kilogram, you need about 10,000 milligrams of ethyl alcohol per kilogram to reach a 50% mortality, an LD50, for the organism tested. Sodium chloride, table salt, can be lethal if given a high enough concentration. So many substances we don't think of as being toxic, like salt, but if we're given a large enough dose, it can be lethal. And then we go all the way down to the most lethal, down at the bottom, dioxin, a dose of 0.001 milligram per kilogram. That's a lethal poison, a highly toxic poison. And then, of course, the botulism toxin produced by a bacteria is a chemical toxin that's one of the most lethal toxins known. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 zeros before we get to the 1. That's in milligrams per kilogram. So a highly toxic substance. If we look at toxicity and toxicity ratings as a way that's sort of more understandable, if we look at the probable lethal dose for humans, okay? We don't always know the lethal dose because we don't do LD50 studies using people, right? We use other organisms. But we can extrapolate to the effect on people, and there's studies that have shown when people have been accidentally poisoned what dose it took to cause lethality. And so we can look at and categorize toxicity based on a rating system from practically non-toxic to super toxic, okay, botulism. And this is simply looked at in terms of a dose per kilogram, and we can put that in a term for the average adult, typical body mass adult. What would it take? Well, if you drank a quart of baking soda, it could kill you. Moderately toxic if you drank an ounce to a pint of toilet bowl cleaner. It could kill you. Okay? You don't want to do that. I'm not recommending anybody do that. You get up to the more highly toxic, 7 drops to 1 teaspoon of arsenic will kill you. This is simply a toxicity rating scale based on dosage for humans, and then putting it in terminology, this for the average adult, if you consume this much, it will be toxic. Now we also look at the response in terms of the duration of the response. Over what period of time does the response occur? There are acute effects, and we can think of acute diseases, but they're not always considered diseases, but there are acute effects. And these are usually an illness or effect that comes on suddenly and lasts for a short period of time, often just a few days or weeks. So you can get a sunburn, and you can recover from that sunburn in a matter of days or a week. Many poisons at high dose and exposure time can have acute effects. So if you consume malthion, which is an insecticide, if you take in an acute dose for a human being, 250 to 470 milligrams per kilogram, that would result in a rapid death unless you were treated right away. And this was, just based on a study where a person accidentally ingested that amount and died. Carbon monoxide poisoning can have an acute effect. you're breathing carbon monoxide, CO, and carbon monoxide, carbon 1 oxygen, tends to replace O2 that attaches to your hemoglobin in your blood and provides oxygen to your body. Well, if you're breathing carbon monoxide, if you're in an enclosed space with a gas engine burning fuel or a stove that's burning fuel and not completely, and it's releasing carbon monoxide, as the concentration increases and as you breathe it for longer, there's carbon monoxide that's replacing the oxygen in your hemoglobin, and you're slowly suffocating yourself. At first, you're going to get a headache, then you're going to start to feel dizzy, then you'll start to be drowsy, you'll lose consciousness, and you'll eventually die if you get large enough dose over that short period of time. That's an acute effect. Chronic effects are conditions that last for a long time, typically more than a year, usually require ongoing medical attention. These are diseases, what we call chronic diseases, like emphysema, heart disease, diabetes, that often come on slowly and then last for long periods of time, sometimes for the rest of a person's life. So an example, asthma is a chronic disease of the lungs, causes problems with getting enough oxygen into your lungs. And a chronic dose of air pollutants, such as ozone and fine particulates, what we call PM 2.5, are the types of environmental toxic substances that can result in a chronic disease, asthma. Now, there's a third category, or I call it a third category, but cancers are considered chronic diseases, but there's a special difference, and I'm going to talk about that right now. Well, first, what is a cancer? When there's damage to DNA in cells, in many different tissues in your body, it can happen. But where you have the cells change to a condition in which there's uncontrolled division, uncontrolled proliferation of cells within a given tissue, that's a cancer. The mutation happens within cells within that tissue in which the control of cell division ceases and the cells start to divide very rapidly and forming a mass we call a tumor, or a cancerous or malignant tumor. And that's what a cancer is. A carcinogen is a toxic agent that causes cells to become cancerous through DNA damage, through mutations to the DNA. And different cancers are given different names depending on the tissue in which, or the organ in which, they originated. So lung cancer originates in lung tissue. Pancreatic cancer originates in pancreatic tissue. And that's how we give names to cancer, is what tissue the original uncontrolled cell proliferation began. Okay? Now the thing about cancer is latency. This delay between the exposure to the toxic agent, the carcinogen, and the biological response, the cancer. And very often, cancers can take years or even decades to manifest after an exposure to a carcinogen. And that exposure may have been an acute exposure, but more often it's a chronic exposure that happened over the term of someone's life, or at a particular time in someone's life, at which point mutations have occurred in cells, but the cancer itself doesn't manifest until the person reaches a certain age, usually over the age of 50. An example, mesothelioma, is a cancer of the tissues that cover internal organs. In your chest and abdomen, there's just a fine membranous tissue. Mesothelioma can have a latency of 20 to 60 years from exposure to the carcinogen. And one of those known carcinogens that causes mesothelioma is asbestos. It's a naturally occurring fiber in certain rocks that then has been used for insulation, different building materials. At any rate, asbestos is a carcinogen, and exposure to asbestos, usually inhalation into the lungs, can result in mesothelioma, but the mesothelioma may not show up in that person for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years after their first exposure to asbestos. So how do toxic agents move through the environment? Well, every toxic agent is going to be different. How do they enter the environment in the first place? Where do they come from? Is it coming out of the smokestack from a factory? Is it being dumped into a stream or a river? Is it infiltrating through the soil into groundwater? Is it contaminating our food? What pathway does it follow as it moves through the environment? How does it move through living organisms? How does it enter that first living organism that may then be consumed by another organism, and it then continues to accumulate and move through the ecosystem through consumption by different organisms of each other? Some toxic agents are quite persistent in the environment, but that persistence is variable depending on the conditions. Remember, the natural environment and also the human environment are quite variable places. And so a toxic chemical in one situation may break down very rapidly, say in the soil, where there's lots of soil microbes to break it down. It may not break down very quickly, though, if it's in a stream system or in the water. And different chemicals will have different persistencies depending on where they're found. When toxic chemicals make their way into living systems, ecosystems, they often go through a process, particularly the ones that are persistent, of what's called biological magnification or bioaccumulation, where an organism takes up that toxic agent, that chemical, and when another animal eats it, when you go up that food chain, up those trophic levels, there's greater and greater concentration of the toxin in the tissues of the animal. So we find that animals at the top of the food chain have the highest concentrations in their system. So, for example, mercury is concentrated in the top predators of fish in the ocean. So we have high concentrations of mercury in swordfish and marlin and some of these top predator fish that are eating smaller fish that have eaten smaller fish that have gotten the mercury in their system from bottom feeding on the original mercury that was in the substrate. DDT is another example of an artificially created pesticide that is highly persistent. It does not break down under many conditions in the environment, and so it bioaccumulated in ecosystems to the point where top predators like eagles and hawks, pelicans, were having large concentrations of DDT in their system because they were consuming other organisms that were eating DDT that had consumed other organisms that got the DDT into their system originally. Of course, our biggest concern in environmental toxicology are those chemicals that are known to be toxic, that are mobile in the environment, that can get to many places in the environment, that can expose people, that are persistent, they last for long periods of time, and that wind up biologically concentrating in animals and plants, and particularly those animals and plants that we might want to consume. So what are some of the big questions in environmental toxicology? What are the questions that we're trying to answer and resolve? And of course, some of the big ones are, what's a safe level of a toxic agent in the environment? What is a safe level in the environment such that if people wind up getting dosed by it, by interacting with your environment, air you breathe, the water you drink, food you eat, what would be a safe level in the environment such that any dose that a human would get would be a safe dose? It would be below the threshold level of dose. So assuming we can't keep, and we know we can't keep all of these chemical toxins out of our environment, and so we strive to ensure that the levels that they are in the environment are safe such that a human that's exposed to them does not get a dose that reaches the threshold level. Can chronic exposure to doses that are below the threshold result in an adverse health response? This is a big topic of study and controversy because we don't know. Because it takes long-term studies of people being exposed and being able to determine that that's the only difference between this group of people and another group of people having a certain response, getting a certain disease, coming down with certain cancers. Okay, so where are there chemical constituents in the environment that we are being chronically exposed to that may be causing health responses later in life over the long term, even though the dose that we're getting is below the threshold, any given dose? How can toxic agents be kept from entering the environment? Of course, keeping our environment safe. We have lots of government agencies involved, but also the knowledge that people gain and are given to protect yourself from exposure to toxic agents. But the first question is, how do we keep them out of the environment in the first place? What can we do? We can put catalytic converters on cars, right? We can put scrubbers on smokestacks. We can have requirements for industries that dump waste into waterways, that waste meets certain levels of cleanup before it can be discharged. What do we do about toxic agents that are already in the environment? How do we remove them from the environment? Those toxic agents that are out there already at lethal doses in certain locations, how do we clean them up? Right? Environmental cleanup. And are there non-toxic agents that we can replace the use of toxic agents? So where we are using, say, toxic cleaning solutions, can we replace them with cleaning solutions that are just as effective but not toxic or less toxic? So all of these are important questions in terms of environmental toxicology, and of course the actions that can be taken, the scientific research that can be done to address these questions and to recommend policies or new discoveries to address these questions. And then lastly, there are the challenges in environmental toxicology that I just want to mention briefly, some of the big challenges in environmental toxicology. First of all, the natural and human environments that we've been talking about in this class, they're complex, they're chaotic. Chemicals don't behave in a natural environment or in a human environment as they do in the laboratory in a test tube. Chemicals are exposed to different conditions. They can be changed and transformed in different ways. They can move or not move. They can persist or not persist. But natural and human environments are complex, they're changeable, and so predicting what a chemical will do in an environment is much more difficult than predicting what will happen to that chemical when you're controlling it in a test tube or a petri dish in a laboratory. Many of the toxic chemicals that get released into the environment occur in more than one form that have different exposure and dose characteristics. They move in different ways. They may have different ways of exposure to people. Toxic chemicals may be changed by interactions with the environment. New toxic chemicals could be created from other toxic chemicals that have different characteristics in terms of how they move through the environment or how toxic they are to humans or to other animals. And of course, the effects on different species can be very different. Some species may be highly affected by certain toxic chemicals and other species not affected at all, and everything in between. And it's not as though the effects that toxic chemicals have on other species doesn't affect humans. It does. So even a toxic chemical that doesn't have a toxic effect on humans, if it has a toxic effect on other animals and other organisms in the environment, that can come back and have adverse effects on people. there are non-lethal chemicals that can retard development, affect the development of different organisms, plants, animals, bacteria, microbes. And it might have a greater ecological impact than a lethal chemical because it affects the ecosystem and the interactions among organisms within the ecosystem. And in fact, indirect effects of chemicals might be greater than the direct effects. A quintessential example is carbon dioxide. It has no real harmful effect on humans at concentrations you're breathing in the atmosphere, even the much greater concentrations that we've put into the atmosphere. But the indirect effect is the warming of the planet, which is having tremendous effects on the human environment and the human population around the world. And those effects are going to continue to become greater and greater adverse effects on the human environment and the human population through the indirect effect of releasing carbon dioxide. And of course, we'll talk about that in great detail when we talk about air pollution and climate change.